Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'een. One of the most common arguments you hear against the Ash'ari school goes something like this. Why are you Ash'aris when Imam Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari wa rahmatullah alayh himself abandoned the Ash'ari school? Just read his final book, Al-Ibana an Usul al-Diyana. And then a quotation is produced from one of the printed editions circulating today. But there is a major historical problem with this argument. The question is not simply, did Imam Ash'ari write a book called Al-Ibana? There is substantial historical evidence that he did. The real question is, can you prove that the text sitting on your bookshelf today represents word for word and passage for passage the Al-Ibana that the early Ash'aris or the early Ash'ari scholars possessed? Those are two completely different claims, and this distinction changes the entire discussion. First, where is the transmission of this particular text? When dealing with the classical Islamic work, especially one being used to establish the creed of an Imam, attribution of the title alone is not enough. We need to ask, what is the textual history? What manuscripts survived? How old are they? From whom were they copied? And what connects the surviving recension to Imam Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari, rahmatullah alayh, who died in the 4th century? This becomes especially important when the disputed passages are being used to overturn the understanding of an entire scholarly tradition, particularly thousands of years. Saying, quote, the scholars recognize the book called Al-Ibana does not automatically authenticate every sentence in a much later manuscript. Imagine that I established through 10 historians that Imam Malik, rahmatullah alayh, wrote the Muwatta. Excellent. That proves the existence and attribution of a book. But if then I produce a manuscript copied centuries later, containing passages absent from earlier transmitted recensions, I cannot simply say, quote, Imam Malik wrote the Muwatta, therefore every sentence in my manuscript must be Imam Malik's, end quote. That does not follow. And the same distinction has been maintained with Al-Ibana. Second, the theological content creates a serious historical problem. The modern Salafi argument normally requires us to believe that Al-Ibana represents a final theological transition of Imam Ash'ari. According to this narrative, he first abandoned the Mu'tazila school and adopted the theological methodology associated with Ibn Kullab, rahmatullah alayh, and then eventually abandoned that methodology for something resembling modern Salafi Wahhabi theology. But here's the problem. The authoritative Ash'ari tradition does not preserve this alleged final transformation. Look at the great transmitters and systemizers of his school, Imam al-Baqillani, Imam ibn al-Furak, Imam al-Bayhaqi, Imam al-Juwayni, rahmatullah alayhim, and the generations who inherited the school after them. Where is this supposed final repudiation of the theological foundations upon which the Ash'ari school was built? And how come none of those major scholars transmitted or reported this going back on all of his positions? If Imam Ash'ari had ended his life repudiating the methodology transmitted in his name by hundreds of scholars, we are being asked to believe that his own school somehow collectively conspired to preserve the wrong Ash'ari madhab. And this becomes even more striking with Ibn al-Furak, because Ibn al-Furak was not some modern Ash'ari attempting to defend the madhab from the Salafis. He died in 406 Hijri, just in the first generation after the 3 blessed golden generations. He devoted himself to collecting, organizing, and transmitting the positions of Imam Ash'ari. Yet the theological Ash'ari transmission by Ibn al-Furak is not the figure recorded by the modern, quote, three stages narrative by the Salafi Wahhabis. So which historical method makes more sense? That the early specialists of the Ash'ari school misunderstood their own Imam, or that passages transmitted through considerably later textual witnesses require critical examination before being used to overturn that scholarly tradition? Third, and this is perhaps the most important point, we actually possess quotations from Al-Ibana through earlier scholars, and this gives us something against which the later text can be compared. Al-Hafidh ibn Asakir, rahmatullah alayh, who died in 571 Hijri, explicitly knew and reported from a book called Al-Ibana. He praised it and transmitted substantial material from it in his book Tabyin Kadhibul Muftari, to defend Imam Ash'ari from the lies that were told about him after his death. This is extremely important because Ibn Asakir did not deny Al-Ibana. It was quite the opposite. He is a witness to it. So when an Ash'ari says that the circulating Al-Ibana contains textual problems, the argument does not have to be, quote, someone invented a completely imaginary book and put Imam Ash'ari's name on it. No, the much more defensible position is there was an authentic book called Al-Ibana, but the later manuscript tradition must be checked against early witnesses to this particular text. And Ibn Asakir gives us this preserved, these passages preserved in his work, compared with later printed recensions. Textual differences appear. That matters enormously because Ibn Asakir lived centuries closer to Imam Ash'ari than modern editors who produce the edition